Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's marathon season, and that is why we are here talking about marathon fueling. I'm Varun Sriram with Generation UCAN, and thrilled as always to be joined by Coach Greg McMillan. Greg, how are you doing today?
Great. How about you?
Can't complain at all. It's funny. Every year we kind of say this, but spring is just around the corner, and marathon season is just around the corner. I know that's what's been top of mind for you and a lot of the athletes you work with. And today we really want to dive deep into the topic of marathon fueling. Greg, I just want to ask you to set the scene for what we're going to talk about today. When you train athletes for the marathon, how much of a variable is the fueling and the nutrition?
It does seem to be like the $64,000 question, right? It's what should I do for fueling? And there's no one answer. It seems to be, you ask 100 marathoners, you get 100 different answers as to what really is the best fueling on race day. And because of that, because there's not one answer, it really does open up sort of the Pandora's box of what should I do. But I think over, now the first running boom was in the 1970s. So we've got a lot of history here of running the marathon and fueling for the marathon. So I think we've kind of figured out some baseline, or at least some starting points for athletes. And then they can at least start there and then tweak and modify until they really dial in exactly the fueling that will work for them on race day.
Now, Greg, you and your experience with athletes have kind of been able to narrow this down. As you mentioned, fueling, there's so much out there, different products, different philosophies, different methods, but you've kind of been able to narrow this down into what you find runners, or at least the runners you work with, are most commonly doing, or the strategies at least that work best. Can you just speak a little bit to that process, how you were able to hone in on this, maybe give us an idea even of the types of marathoners you've worked with to help you identify this as well.
Well, I kind of started on myself, right? So in studying exercise physiology, you obviously study sports nutrition, you're trying to figure out performance. And I was running races and marathons, so trying to figure it out for myself. And so that's obviously a good way to learn. And then I get to work with, the full spectrum. So some brand new runners just coming off the couch, trying to finish their first marathon, tons of people, middle of the pack, Boston qualifiers, and then even some people at the front end of the race who, they're only running a little over 2 hours for the marathon. So working with all those people, you really get to see a lot of differences and a lot of similarities into kind of what works for athletes, what they've tried, and what seems to be successful on race day. There's never any guarantee. That's the one problem with sports nutrition, right? It's a problem with the marathon, really, is that there's no guarantee. Even if you do all the right training, you're going to have a great day. But at least we can narrow it down and kind of figure out, using what we know from sports science, to give us the groundwork as to what we want to achieve with our marathon fueling. And then we put that into practice for our own individual sort of traits. And then, of course, the day, how is it going to be, hot, cold, that sort of thing.
Great. Well, to really dive into it, Greg, and let me just first set the scene for how we're going to spend the next 50 minutes here or so today. You're going to help us identify really these top three marathon fueling strategies that you've identified in working with athletes. And then we're going to have a treat. Some of the less popular strategies, I guess, that Greg's talking about, but that have become more successful and more popular in recent years. We're actually going to have some real world athletes come on and share exactly how they've utilized these strategies that Greg's talking about with you here on the webinar. So this will give folks a chance to not only learn the theory behind it, but also get some idea of how to do this in practice. Greg, before we dive into the top three, there's sort of some fundamental things about marathon fueling that are important for folks to understand. So why don't we start there? What can you tell us overall about marathon fueling that will sort of inform our decisions on how to go ahead and fuel for the race?
Well, as it says right there, one of the things that athletes need to understand is that the bulk of the fuel that you will need for your marathon is already on board you. That's part of the training process, that we learn to burn fat really efficiently, and we have plenty of fat for the marathon. We also store more of our carbohydrate for use during the race. So we have a bigger store of our muscle and liver glycogen. And then our body learns to sort of better utilize all this fuel to be more efficient on race day so we can get to the finish line. So ultimately, all we need to do is supplement a little bit of carbohydrate because we're limited in those stores. So if we just really use our fueling to think of it as, I need to supplement some of this carbohydrate because I don't quite have enough, that sort of removes this idea that you've got to provide all the fuel you need for the marathon. And that's simply not the case. We're just supplementing just to keep our blood glucose level happy because that makes our brain happy, and we're providing some of the carbohydrate that our body can burn for fuel. And then of course we have to add electrolytes and hydration and sometimes stimulants like caffeine. People like to have some of that in their marathon fueling as well. So I think it's important to understand in the beginning that marathon fueling is about just adding a little bit of what you need that you don't have enough of, but it's not trying to over fuel or fuel for the complete race. You have the majority on board already.
So with that, why don't we dive right into the top 3 strategies, Greg? And maybe playing off of what you just said, we can start with strategy 1. So go ahead. What should we know about strategy 1?
Well, strategy run really came from the first running boom in the 1970s. And these were fast runners. You know, the first running boom was more 3.5 hour marathoners. And at that time, the whole focus was, how can we get carbohydrate into the stomach and then out of it very quickly into the intestines where it could be absorbed very quickly to raise the blood glucose level? Because if the blood glucose level goes low, the brain gets very unhappy and it will cut power, send more fatigue feelings to you. So a lot of racing is sort of maintaining this ideal blood glucose level. And so that really came what I think we call now the fast acting carbohydrate strategy. And this was, you know, taking in carbohydrates that will be emptied from the stomach very quickly, absorbed very quickly, so you had a very quick rise in your blood glucose level, and that would provide that fuel, the extra fuel that you needed. That's where we see the development of 6 to 8% carbohydrate solutions, and the majority of sports drinks sort of match that profile. Sometimes they have different flavors and slight different composition, but ultimately that's what kind of came from that initial research. And runners were advised to drink 4 to 8 ounces of this sports drink every 2 miles or 15 minutes. Again, these are pretty fast runners. And if they did that correctly, it would raise the blood glucose level. And then, of course, the body's sensitive to blood glucose, so it'll lower the glucose if it gets too high. Then you dosed again, and that allowed you to sort of maintain a happy range of blood glucose. And that kind of became the original marathon fueling strategy. That had some problems, of course, because, you know, if you miss time, this sort of increase and decrease, you miss time the wave, if you will, then you can feel bad in the race because your blood glucose will go low. As a result, we then saw maybe 10 or so years later the development of energy gels. And so runners then they were given more carbohydrate, more like a 25% solution that was thicker, and then they would chase that and dilute it with water during the race. And this was a more concentrated form, taken less frequently, usually around every 45 minutes. And this was to try to avoid, you know, sort of the spike crash that could happen if you just mistimed your fueling. And I think we've all been in races where we've missed fueling, right? It's just sometimes there's traffic jams at the aid stations. So the gel sort of came in as a solution that might be able to overcome that negative. The negative with the gel, of course, is that, you know, as you get later in the race, your gut changes quite a bit, and it no longer really likes a lot of fast-acting carbohydrate. And that's where you hear people saying, man, I love that gel at mile 5, but at mile 20, I almost gagged on it. You hear a lot of gag reflex with that, as the body just is not really prepared. You really have to dilute even more those fast acting carbohydrates later in the race. So we kind of started with, okay, what's optimal physiologically to get that blood glucose up? Well, if we get our timing wrong, that can be problematic. And then we've got gels, so that provided a good solution for a lot of runners, but again, sort of some issues, particularly later in marathons as the gut changed and you became dehydrated, it tolerated sugar less. And around this time, now we're getting into the second running boom. And the second running boom, it was much slower. You know, that was where we saw charity marathon groups and the focus was more on finishing the race. So we saw now the average finishing time being more like 4.5 hours. So now you go from an athlete where they're trying to really get fast acting carbohydrates in because they're running really fast. If you use that same strategy for somebody that's going to be out there for 4.5 hours, you can see how the gut just gets kind of destroyed. And so we saw a lot of people from the second running boom looking for something that was a little more tolerable, a little bit more steady energy, almost food-like, as opposed to the spike crash, the real fast-acting carbohydrate. They were searching for a solution that would avoid that common problem. And of course, you know, Generation UCAN being the perfect example of a new product, a manipulated carbohydrate that is absorbed a little bit more slowly. So if we think about this range, let's see if I can do this with my hand. So here's an acceptable range of blood glucose. With the fast acting, we were doing this within that range. We were just spiking, crashing, and hopefully you timed it to where you never crashed. And now we see with the strategy number 2, where we're trying to maintain a little bit more steady blood glucose as opposed to this building it really high, it drops low and having to dose again. So the dosing was less frequent, usually every, you know, hour or so of a feeding. People were using all kinds of products. I mean, you saw baby food, you saw all kinds of fruits. There was lots of different things people were trying, again, to avoid sort of the scenario we talked about in strategy number 1, the fast acting, you know, 4 to 8 ounces every 15 minutes or a gel every 40 minutes. This was a little bit more like feeding of the athlete. And that seemed to avoid the gastrointestinal problems that so many runners were having with strategy number 1, the fast acting carbohydrate. Now, fast acting carbohydrate can work. A lot of people have had great success, and it's certainly something worth people giving a try. The second scenario seems to avoid the biggest problems with the strategy number 1, and I think we see a lot of runners sort of searching for that. I don't want to have to go to the bathroom. I want to keep fueling during the race, instead of getting kind of so sick in their stomach that they stop fueling late in the race just when they need the fuel. So it's kind of interesting, these different types of runners and 2 really different strategies. The goal being that we maintain our blood glucose so we can keep our brain happy. We can provide a little bit of carbohydrate that our muscles can burn while we're running at marathon pace. We can sort of stave off the reduction in our liver and muscle glycogen by doing this, and everything stays happy. It's just a matter of, can you time it with the sort of fast acting, or are you better with a little bit of a slower acting carbohydrate? I think a lot of people are having great success with strategy number 2 simply because they feel better and they typically reduce the gastrointestinal distress that many have. And if you're running a race, there's nothing worse than you've got to peel off and find a bathroom during the race. You just lose so much time. So that's kind of been strategy number 2, is using more of the slow acting carbohydrates, more food like.
So let me jump in, Greg, and ask you a couple questions. And it's a great kind of breakdown between the differences of 1 and 2. For you personally, when you started running the marathon, strategy 1 was really all that existed, right? So I guess, what was your personal experience like? Why did you at some point decide that you needed to find something new from strategy 1? What was kind of the reasoning behind that, and what's been your experience with these 2 different strategies on a personal level?
Well, because I failed. because I was very sensitive to the spike and crash. So whenever I would take the sports drink in the race, I would have this immediate, I feel like $1,000,000, which would last about 5 minutes. And then I would feel really bad and very low energy. And then when I tried to add the gel to it, that just made it even worse. Number one, it was kind of problematic to take. Number two, my body did not like it later in the race. And as a result, I just wasn't fueling enough, mainly because I was sick to my stomach and my energy levels were just, they fluctuated too much. And I think some people know if they're kind of sugar sensitive. I've certainly coached athletes and they can take 4 or 5 or 6 gels across a marathon and have no problem. Whereas to me, that sounds horrible. That sounds very unappealing, but for them, it works. So for me, it was really a case of I had a degree in exercise physiology. I knew what I should do during the race, and I was trying to do it, but it was not working. And I think that's why a lot of people have moved to strategy number 2, at least trying it, so that they can experiment and see, okay, can I avoid the issues that I have? And so for me, it was really just, okay, this isn't working. I'm not able to fuel enough using this strategy. I need to find a different solution. And luckily, I learned about UCAN and I gave it a try. Sorry about that.
On TV, it happens. So, Greg, I got another question for you, so I can put you on mute for a moment. So you talked a little bit about where strategy number 1 came from. The first running boom, the focus was on fast marathoners, and that's kind of where this strategy developed. So, when a new marathoner today is looking at, their traditional running media or looking for recommendations, and they see things like 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour or 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, that sort of philosophy is very much coming from strategy number 1, right? Like kind of the mainstream marathon recommendations are based on this initial first strategy that you outlined. And I think you're on mute, Greg. We might need to have you off mute for a second. Let me see.
Okay, I think I'm back now. Yes, that when you see numbers and you see a certain number of calories per hour, then that's typically coming from strategy number 1, and that's where they're averaging out, the sports drink and or gel to figure out the number of calories. But it's not so much about the number of calories. It's not that those calories are all going to be used to fuel your running. What they're doing is trying to time this spike and crash. And you have to take in a certain number of calories in a certain frequency so that your average stays within the happy zone of your blood glucose level. So as we mentioned from the beginning, you already have the bulk of the energy you need for the marathon on board. All you're doing is supplementing to keep your blood glucose in this happy zone. Now, you can do it in different ways. We've talked about, here's your zone, you spike it, it comes back down, you hit it again, and you can follow that pattern. And that will take more carbohydrate ingested if you do it that way, versus I'm just going to ingest, say, every hour with UCAN, and then I don't need as many calories, but I'm going to maintain within this happy zone of my blood glucose. I've got enough carbohydrate that some of it will be burned as fuel, some of it will stay as blood glucose, keep the brain happy. So when you start to see those numbers, that's really what that's coming from, is this sort of averaging over time. We know that runners don't have to ingest that many calories in order to run the marathon. We know that from the results of Generation UCAN. We know that if you take UCAN, you will get significantly less calories per hour than if you use strategy number 1, yet people have plenty of power across the race and at the end. So again, the numbers kind of were reverse engineered, if you will, into this idea of how do we keep blood glucose stable. And when you're doing it within the cycling up and down, that takes a lot more carbohydrate than if you do it in a more stable kind of view. So it becomes confusing for people for sure. And sometimes, if they look at a different fueling strategy, like strategy number 2, and even if they're not using UCAN, but they're using a different product, they will certainly see they're going to ingest a lot fewer calories than they would if they used a gel and sports drink. But again, I haven't found that that's the problem. It's not a how many calories do you get in problem. It is, can you keep your blood glucose happy?
That's a perfect way to kind of differentiate it and summarize it, Greg. I wanted to take this opportunity just to kind of lend a little bit of information on two things that we're getting a few questions about in regards to UCAN, and then wanted to dive into strategy 3 with you. So to piggyback off a lot of what Greg is saying, we showed this briefly earlier, but when we talk about the UCAN product, this super starch is really the key ingredient and what's delivering this slow release of energy. So most of the traditional products Greg was referencing, your sports drinks or your gel, are based on these fast-acting carbs, whether it's simple sugars or something like maltodextrin that's designed to give you that quick burst. But as we can see on this graph, so maltodextrin, the blue line, being what you typically find in a fueling product for strategy 1, whereas super starch is what's in UCAN. And you can just see the difference that Greg has been talking about on your blood sugar when you take UCAN. So if what Greg's saying, it's really about that ability to keep your blood sugar stable and not just about how many calories you need, per hour or per every half hour, you can start to understand why strategy 2 with UCAN, because the carbohydrate is acting differently in terms of how it balances your blood sugar. That's why it requires a little bit of a different protocol. And just to piggyback on that, we find a lot of the times that with UCAN, because it's that slower acting fuel source, again, to piggyback off what Greg was saying, you're simply not taking as much of it. So when your blood sugar is stable for longer, you're able to space out those doses of fueling much more than if you're taking in something that's going to hit you quickly over and over and over again. So some of the stomach issue, certainly that people finding approach 2 and the UCAN approach to be easier on the stomach is because of the nature of our carbohydrate. It is an easier digesting type of carb. It's a very complex starch rather than a sugar. But the other thing is just simply the logic of if you're putting less in your stomach over the period of 3 or 4 hours while you're exercising, there's just less going in that could potentially bother you. So a couple things to just piggyback on what Greg said. And then, Greg, one question on strategy 2 that we had from the audience was certainly UCAN from a sports nutrition standpoint is unique in supporting strategy 2, being a slow acting carbohydrate where most of what you find out there is quick and fast acting from a product standpoint. But with strategy number 2, let's say folks used UCAN a little bit, and then you also kind of mentioned here the food approach. What are some foods you might see runners using that would be in line with strategy 2 in your experience? Anything stand out that people have used in terms of whole food or real food for this approach?
Yeah, I think dates and figs and any of those kinds of fruits, I guess you'd call, is something that seems to be popular. Also, kids, little squishy fruit, baby food type things. I'm not sure exactly what they're called, but any of those people are using as well. Again, more food-like in a portable container that they can take, once every hour or so. Seems to be something that people are having success with. Applesauce, any of those kind of, think like a baby, I suppose, where you're just thinking about something that's easily digestible, easy to, consume while you're running, and kind of keeps you full for a while. And that's one of the key things with strategy number 2 is that it is it's not a very complicated sports nutrition plan for marathon day. And that is very nice for runners to not have to worry so much about a very complex or complicated nutrition strategy. When you have to rely on, getting at the aid stations exactly what you need in the right amount, you've got to have your gels at the right time, all of that, that becomes a more complicated strategy where people are fueling more frequently. Whereas with strategy number 2, it's less frequent fueling, and as a result, that makes the sort of fueling plan a little bit easier. And easy's good on marathon day because you just want to be on automatic pilot through the bulk of the race because you know it's going to get difficult later. And it's really about, okay, how can I keep my body happy and cruising along and avoiding issues? And that's been, at least for me, and again, everybody's a little bit different, that's been the savior for me in marathoning with Generation UCAN, is that for the bulk of the race, I'm not having these issues. I'm not having a complicated strategy. I'm not feeling great and then bad. I'm just feeling more steady. And that to me was very helpful. And I think to a lot of athletes, they enjoy that as well.
Awesome. And like I mentioned, in about 20 minutes, we will be bringing on a couple folks who have utilized this strategy for a marathon. So for
Yeah.
everyone who's asking questions about how do I carry it, when should I take it, don't you worry. We have thought of you, and those answers will be
Yeah.
coming up soon. So Greg, let's dive into strategy 3, which is going to bring together both the elements you've talked about. So what is the third strategy to marathon fueling?
So the third strategy really came out of, I guess, the most recent neuroscience research, where we started to learn that if you can make your brain really excited and really happy, it will keep performing for you. When it is unhappy and unexcited, it will not perform for you. And I think any of us who have run a marathon and maybe not had a positive experience, that's what we've sort of experienced late in the race, where our brain just wasn't, it kind of gave up, if you will, and sent a lot of fatigue feelings. And so strategy number 3 is kind of a combo strategy where for the bulk of the race, you use the slow acting carbohydrates. So say you're going to run a 4-hour marathon, you would use Generation UCAN as suggested. 30 to 60 minutes before the race, you have a serving. Every hour during the race, you have another serving. But then in the last 30 to 60 minutes, you might begin to think about your brain and getting it really excited for the finish of the race. We even know that you don't even have to drink the carbohydrate. If you just put it in your mouth and rinse it and spit it out, your brain thinks, oh, I'm getting carbohydrate. This is good. I'm going to be fine. So a lot of runners are sort of using the slow acting strategy number 2 for the bulk of the race. And then the last 30 to 60 minutes, they will either start to consume sports drink or a gel, or even begin to rinse with the sports drink at every aid station, even swallow it or spit it out. Again, trying to get the brain ramped up. Caffeine is used a lot late in races. A lot of gels have caffeine. Again, trying to get the brain really excited for the finish, because if it's not fatigued, then you can keep pushing. And so part of this strategy number 3 has been, okay, let's keep the brain happy with a steady blood glucose level through the bulk of the race. But then when you get into the last few miles, that's where let me just, hit my brain with some fast acting carbohydrate, maybe some caffeine, something along those lines, so that it gets really excited for the finish. Maybe, kind of the best of both worlds, in that we keep our GI system really happy through the race, but then we really focus on keeping our brain happy over the last few minutes of the race. You don't have to do it. Strategy 2 powers plenty of people all the way to the finish line, but I think it's another thing that I see athletes experimenting with, trying to kind of not have any GI stuff all the way through the race. But then once they they can smell the finish line, then they're like, okay, I'm going to start using fast acting carbohydrates, diluting them quite a bit, but that's going to give me this sort of mental excitement and boost toward the finish line.
So with all this, Greg, before we bring on our folks to give us some examples of these different strategies, like if you're a runner training for the marathon, how do you go about identifying which one is right for you? Do you have any recommendations where people might want to start? Is there sort of a first line approach, and then if that doesn't work, you switch to something else? How does a runner go about figuring out which strategy to employ?
Well, that's the hard part, is that you have to experiment. First thing I always ask athletes is, what is your sugar sensitivity? Start to think about, are you sensitive to sugar or not? If you are sensitive to sugar, meaning if you have some candy, you feel terrible later, kind of like your kid at Halloween, right? if you are that way, strategy number 2 is better for you to start with, because you're probably going to avoid any of the sugar sensitivity. If you love sugar, love candy, love all of that, then maybe strategy number 1 is where you should start and give it a try on some long runs and see how you feel. And then, you'll learn, is that strategy number 1 going to work for me or not? Or am I better with strategy 2 or strategy 3? Ultimately, your body will tell you. If you have a negative experience, certainly more than one time, that's not the strategy for you. You should switch strategies to go with something that you're going to have a positive experience. What you should feel is that you are powerful over the last portion of your long runs. That's the whole thing with fueling, is so that you feel powerful at the end of your long runs. You might feel great early, but everybody feels great early. It's really about, where do you have enough sort of energy at the end of your long runs? And that's what we're trying to figure out with these nutrition strategies. And then you have to practice it over and over and over again. Put yourself in more and more race-like conditions. That means the intensity, the duration, the weather conditions, the terrain, all of those things. You need to mimic those, because we'll see sometimes, somebody has great fueling when the conditions are sort of not very close to the race, but then they go into the race and it fails because they haven't practiced it in sort of race-like competition. That's what the whole winter is for spring marathoners, is really just get this dialed in so you can practice it in long runs. You can practice it in sort of race specific long runs. You can practice it in tune-up races, so that by the time you get to the marathon, it's automatic pilot. I'm doing this along the way, and I'll adjust how I feel, but I feel really confident that this is going to work for me.
It's like everything, practice makes perfect. But
Yeah.
before runners have a chance to practice it, at least let's try to help them out a little bit by bringing on some folks here now, Greg, that have tried, specifically strategies number 2 and 3, because I think we have plenty of examples with strategy number 1 being the traditional strategy of runners that have tried that one, but really want to hone in on strategies 2 and 3. So to start us off here, and bear with me for a moment while we get the technology going, but we're going to bring on 2 marathon runners first. We've got one of them right here, Durrett Franks, out in the Bay Area, and we'll also have Nicole Porath join us. So Nicole's going to be joining us by phone, but she's out in Minnesota. Durrett, how are you doing today?
Hey, good to see you. Good to see you too, Greg.
Great to have you on. So Durrett, let's start out. I think Greg may have dropped for a moment, but no problem. Let's start out by talking a little bit first about your marathon experience. Give us a little bit of a sense of your experience as a marathoner, and perhaps, what strategy you started with when you first got into the sport.
So I'm trying to think back to when I first did my first marathon. My first marathon was actually in a standalone, it was in an Ironman. So I hadn't run a standalone marathon yet. And so that was in 2001, was the Ironman New Zealand. And I went into that with as much simple sugar as I could, because that's what we were doing. And I was going to be on the course and a long time. And there was a lot of Coca-Cola on the course at that time. I then ran my first marathon a couple years after that, and it was the Seattle Marathon, and I qualified for the Boston Marathon. Still using simple sugars at that time, and my pacing was more of a fade. It wasn't planned as a fade, but that had a lot to do with nutrition strategy. I probably also went off a little fast because I was anxious and inexperienced. But and then again, some more marathons inside of Ironman. But specific to a standalone marathon, I think my most memorable experience would be at the California International Marathon, and this might have been about 4 years ago, and I did qualify for Boston. And I used a strategy of steady pacing. CIM is in Sacramento, and it has a negative elevation overall, so you're losing elevation. But much like, and I use strategy 3, and I didn't plan strategy 3. I planned to use UCAN the entire way. But much like Greg said, you know, you get to that last 30 to 60 minutes where you hit the wall, and I just wasn't feeling good. It wasn't just like my muscles were tired, my brain was. And if your brain isn't in the game, that could throw off your pacing. So it does throw off your pacing. So I just reached for some Coke on the course and said, forget it. I just got to, you know, do what makes me happy. And, you know, Greg is absolutely right. You know, and I say this to a lot of my clients, is that put a little sugar on your tongue if you need some of that extra pickup. The brain knows that that help is on the way.
So logistically, Dorette, for your marathon at CIM, where you used strategy 3, which again, for folks listening, is the combo strategy, can you take us through for the race fueling, what you did in terms of UCAN before the race, what you did in terms of fueling the first half of the race, and then how you might have changed? Like, what was the fueling for the duration of the marathon, and how did you space it out?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I get asked this question a lot by people, given that I'm a dietitian and a coach, like, what should I have on race day? And it has a lot to do with what you've been practicing for your daily nutrition. So like the night before, just to keep it simple, I'm not going to carb load. I don't carb load even a couple of nights before. So that morning, I just keep it simple. What's really comfortable for me is a little protein, such as a hard-boiled egg, about 1 ounce slice of avocado, and I'll have a yeast-free, whole grain sprouted slice of bread, like a manna bread. That works for me. I've been practicing it. I'm used to just having that extra fiber, but I like to also feel satiated, which is what the protein does help for me. If I'm one of these people, I'm always hungry. Some people don't even recognize when they're hungry. I'm always hungry. So I'll have that breakfast about 90 minutes before the race. And then about 20 minutes before, I will have had, I don't remember if I had a UCAN bar, which I love, because again, I get that I'm chewing and my brain's getting that signal, okay, satiety, it's not going down the gullet really fast. Or if it's the UCAN drink mix, just 1 scoop. And then with an electrolyte replacement fluid, UCAN works great, especially for that time of year, because it's in the early part of winter. It's cold. I'm not sweating a lot. I'm not losing a lot of electrolytes, and it's just perfect. So that takes me to from 20 minutes before the race until 90 minutes later. So I'm looking at about 1 hour, 15 minutes into that race is when my body personally that's when I'll take in the next serving of Generation UCAN. And I might just kind of throw in here that I put a concentrated formula in a flask. And I carry this with me because some people do ask, well, how are you going to get it? And so I make it the night before, shake it up in my UCAN bottle, concentrated 3 scoops in this entire thing. And so it becomes a gel for me to use on the course. So again, an hour 15 in, I'll have my just a squirt of the UCAN. I know I've got about three servings in here. And I'm not going by mile markers, I'm really going by time. And I know again that my body about every 75 to 90 minutes, depending on the intensity, will require UCAN. So I will have about 2 servings. So again, 115 and then about 230. And so if I'm targeting to come in below 4 hours, my qualifying time is 4 hours, but I'm always going to shoot for a lower time. So I'm looking at a 350 finish, or a little less if I can eke that out these days. I'm going to have, well, now I've practiced the strategy of I'm going to have a simple sugar the last 10K. I want that kick. I want my legs to feel that it has that kick, or I want the brain to know, like, hey, we're going home. So 2 servings of UCAN about 90 minutes apart. And I have a little extra just in case, and then some Coke along the way, because I already have the carbohydrate in my body. I'm kind of good to go.
Awesome. That's a great and very good specifics, Dorette. We really appreciate that, because people wanted to kind of know like exactly how to space this out. So it's helpful to know how long that pre-race serving lasted, how you spaced out your UCAN servings, and how you carried it, and then what time you took the gel. So thank you so much, Dorette. Thanks for sharing, and really appreciate having you on.
Thank you, Vaughn.
Let's stick with strategy 3 and get Nicole Porath, who's joining us by phone. Hey, Nicole, you there with us?
Hey.
Hey, how's it going? So Nicole Porath is joining us from Minnesota, and like I said, she's on the phone, but we can see her picture up there on the screen, so we feel like she's with us. And Nicole has a couple cool distinctions. She about a year ago now set the still unofficial but soon to be official world record for a stroller half marathon, and she's actually going to tell us a little bit about her marathon fueling for her most recent marathon, which was 11 months postpartum after having her second kid. So with all that, welcome, Nicole.
Thanks, Byron.
Awesome.
And I'll put a plug that it was a double stroller record. So 2 kids, double stroller.
Awesome. How about
so
that?
much harder than a single stroller.
Very cool. Well, Nicole, you, in addition to what I just talked about, have been an elite runner for many years as well. So you've kind of tried it all from marathon fueling. Just kind of take us through your evolution in marathon fueling. Why have you started using strategy 3, the combo strategy? What got you to that point? And then specifically, what do you do?
Sure. So I've done 15 or 16 marathons, the majority of which were using strategy number 1 that Greg talked about. So prior to discovering Generation UCAN, I would take anywhere between 6 to 8 gels during a marathon, one at the very start and then another every 35 to 40 minutes. And that worked decently fine for me. I always gauged how many I took by how full my stomach felt and would take in as much as I could until I felt that the sloshing feeling just start. I'd always end up a little lightheaded and foggy, almost dizzy towards the end of a marathon. And I thought that was normal because it happened at the end of every marathon. But now that I've tried UCAN and strategy number 3 specifically, I think what it was actually that my brain was becoming foggy because it didn't have the glucose it needed as an energy source, because your brain can only use glucose, it can't use fats or fatty acids. So despite taking in so much over the course of the marathon, I must not have had enough. Then enter Generation UCAN. I found Generation UCAN through Gabe Grunwald, who turned me on to it, and she said, "Gosh, Nicole, your story sounds like something UCAN would help with." I was a little skeptical at first, but it has been a complete game changer for me. First, it helped me to teach my body how to use fat as a fuel, and that was just over time, strategically using it before and after my workouts in conjunction with fasted morning runs. And that fat burning ability, along with Generation UCAN's slow burning properties, also allowed me to cut down dramatically on fueling during a marathon, and honestly totally eliminated my lightheadedness at the end of a marathon. So now I'll go through my specific ritual, if that's
Fantastic.
what you call it, before a marathon.
Absolutely.
And so I'll talk specifically about Twin Cities that I raced last fall, October of 2017, where I finished in 2:58, which is about 14 or so minutes off my PR. But it was also my first marathon after 2 pregnancies and just 11 months postpartum. And so I was a little rusty getting back into the whole fueling mindset, but I went back to what had worked for me before pre-pregnancy, and it worked like a gem this time around too. So about 2 hours before, I eat about 250 to 300 calories, mostly carbs, a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat as well. And then about an hour before the race, I've mixed up a packet of UCAN, fairly concentrated, in a bottle, and I'll bring that to the start of the race and finish it kind of up until about 30-35 minutes before the start of the race. And then I'll carry gels with me, and I'll take the first at mile 18. And
wow.
that really surprised me.
I wanted to pick that out, Nicole. You went from 6 to 8 gels in a marathon to now taking your first gel at mile 18.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It's incredible. No, the first marathon I did with UCAN, I brought a whole bunch with me just in case, because I thought there's no way that I'm not going to have to carry 5 with me, which is a pain to do.
Absolutely.
So I carried a whole bunch with, and I didn't need it. So I take one at about mile 17, 18, and then I open a second towards the end of the race, mile 22, 23, and I kind of sip on it. Both of those gels are caffeinated, and I think that also helps. But those gels give me just a little bit of a spike in energy, and that's all I need from the start to a finish of a marathon, literally.
That's really cool, Nicole. Really cool to hear. And thanks so much for, both sharing kind of what you used to do and also the impact you've seen in training. One of the things you mentioned, we've had a couple questions, on is something you mentioned, getting leaner in training. So not to spend too much time on that, but just to answer a couple questions, one of the things about UCAN and the properties of a slow release carbohydrate is, as Nicole was saying, when you keep your blood sugar steady and don't constantly have this influx of sugar coming in, your body becomes more efficient at burning fat. So when we're exercising or even pre-exercise, if we're not taking these fuel sources that dump all these fast-acting carbohydrates into our body and we're more able to stay steady, that's going to allow your body to become more efficient at tapping into and utilizing that fat. So it's not magic. Like Nicole said, it comes with strategy and it comes with being smart about how you implement UCAN into your workouts. But you can absolutely see a benefit both in terms of your body composition and how much calories you need to take with utilizing UCAN, and that is in part because of the slow release carbohydrate properties, the stabilization of blood sugar. All of that feeds into becoming more efficient at burning fat. But Nicole, with that, I just want to thank you so much. Thanks for coming on. Congratulations on all the great success in your recent marathons, and hope you keep it up.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we've had some great feedback from 2 folks who have employed strategy number 3, and now want to bring on a couple folks who have employed strategy number 2. So if you guys remember, strategy number 2 is the solo UCAN all slow carb strategy. And just give me a moment here. We're going to cue 2 folks up who can talk a little bit about their experience. So we've got Greg Stein. Greg's joining us out in New Jersey. He's a marathoner. And we've got Derek Circa, who's joining us out in New Mexico, also a marathoner. Greg and Derek, thanks so much for being here with us.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. So Greg, let's start with you. So as we dive into strategy number 2, which is the UCAN only strategy, I guess, we should say the slow acting carbohydrate strategy, perhaps. A little bit of background. How did you come to strategy number 2? Had you tried anything else? Was there a reason that you turned to strategy number 2? Give us a little bit about yourself as a marathoner.
Yeah, so like Greg was saying earlier, I felt like I was a science experiment. I tried, you name the strategy, I tried the strategy, and I tried it in training. I tried different kinds of gels, different kinds of bars, and I used to subscribe to the strategy that you had to get in so many calories per hour, depending upon, as Dorette said, the time I was going to be on my feet for a race, and all I ended up feeling was bloated. I ended up feeling things were sloshing around inside me. I was taking in a big quantity of calories, and all I was getting in return was a bloated, heavy feeling without getting the return from all the calories that I was taking in. And ultimately, at the end of a long race, I was just, had a very, very upset stomach, and I couldn't take in enough fluid to kind of wash it through. So I started looking for something different that I wouldn't have to think about so much, because even once I found something that worked for me, very few race courses had it on the course. So I had to figure out what was I going to carry with me. And if I ran out of whatever my strategy at the moment was, it was never on course, because whatever was sponsoring the aid stations was something different than I had trained for. And then I was fortunate enough to get introduced to Generation UCAN, somebody who met you actually at an expo one day, who brought back to me, and I was doing long distance triathlons at the time. And triathlon is even more complex with fueling over the length of a race, that I just started training with it first, because it's never a good strategy to try something for the first time on race day. And I just fell in love with it to the point where I don't have to think about it anymore. My first couple of marathons, By the time I'd get to 16 to 20 miles, and the comment was made earlier about how many gels I had to carry for what was somewhat working for me. Now with UCAN, and again, similar to some of the other strategies that were shared, I'm very sensitive the last couple of days leading up to a marathon, what I'm taking in. I don't carbo load the night before at all. And now the morning of a race, all I'm doing before the race, about 30 minutes, is a full serving of Generation UCAN. And then I actually carry with me another full serving of Generation UCAN that I'll take from 2 to 2.5 hours into the race. And I carry it in a fuel belt like this. This is actually my fuel belt. And, personally, I like the taste of UCAN for me is good when it's really cold. So in one of these flasks, I actually will shake it up the night before and mix it in here and freeze it. So at about 2 to 2.5 hours into the race, it's thawed out and ready for me to drink and consume. And that's all I'm taking for the duration of the race. I'm not taking in any gels later in the race. I'm not taking anything else in. It used to be I was so upset stomach at the end of a race, I couldn't take anything in and I was ready to collapse at the end of a race. Now I'm good to go. I can walk away, not quickly, but I can walk away at the end of a race, and I don't really feel any kind of a crash anywhere at the race end or after.
So, Greg, if I could just dive in to two things you said slightly deeper, and then Derek, want to hear from you as well. One of the things you mentioned was as you carry the UCAN with you, how are you spacing out the fueling again, if you just don't mind reiterating that? So you're taking it before. What point in the race would you say are you taking your next dose of UCAN?
Yeah, so I don't kind of meter it out. I actually, again, I find that for my body, the way my body metabolizes things, if I've taken it, 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes before, I'll actually carry a throwaway bottle of a little bit more of UCAN right into the corrals, so that while I'm standing there, that's when I'm taking that dose. Toss it. I'll buy time at about 2 to 2:20 into the race. I'll slam the entire second serving down, and then I just won't have to think about it, because I get in the kind of mental wacky race zone where to remind myself to take it in every 30 minutes or 15 minutes, it's just easier for me to just take it in. And I try to take it in advance of when my body needs it. I'm not waiting until I'm starting to feel hungry or in need of the fuel. We haven't really talked much about hydration from an electrolyte replacement. I embraced UCAN Hydrate as well. So in my other 3 bottles, I'm actually carrying the mix of UCAN Hydrate pre-mixed. I hope for a sponsorship of more long distance races where they actually have hydrate on the course, which I haven't really found yet. But that's what I'm doing in terms of mixing. That I'm taking in every 15 or 20 minutes and then supplementing that with water later in the race.
Perfect. Thank you. Good. That was very, very helpful, the clarification you made. And for that comment about UCAN Hydrate on the race course, all I can say is stay tuned. Derek, how about yourself? Give us a little bit of the same background on yourself. What strategy did you employ when you first started diving into these marathons, and what caused the shift over to strategy 2?
Sure. I did my first marathon 20 years ago. In fact, I know it was exactly 20 years ago. And at the time, it was only, fueling strategy 1. So it was a lot of gels, and I was a new runner. I went through the crashes. I had the GI issues after the race, and it wasn't pleasant, so didn't run another marathon for a while. Took up another sport. You may have seen it in the Olympics recently, curling. It was a lot of fun. When we got back into running about 8 years ago, we were fortunate enough to live in New Haven, where UCAN is based right nearby where we were. So we actually ran into you very early on in Generation UCAN life history. And being an engineer, I was intrigued by the science. I knew I was going to be using gels for a while, and I thought, hey, this is kind of neat. Started using it a little bit for curling first, and then I was like, hey, it's working for curling. I'm going to start using it for running. And I was so impressed. The very first time I used it was for a half marathon. I took my 1 serving before the race, and it lasted the entire race. I took nothing else, an hour and 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours at a time. And I was hooked. So when I got back into marathons about 4 years ago, I was like, by then I was pure UCAN all the time. And my fueling strategy is very similar to what you've heard. I have my breakfast about 3 hours beforehand. It's a shake, almond milk, a serving of the Cocoa Delight UCAN, some peanut butter. That seems to work well for me. Bananas, there's bananas in there as well. So do that 3 hours ahead of time. Then I'll take a serving of the UCAN about 20 minutes before the race. Again, like Greg, I bring a sort of a saturated solution in a throwaway bottle and take that ahead of time. And then I have the same fuel belt as Greg does, but I use 2 of the bottles, the 10-ounce bottles, fill each one up with 2 servings of UCAN. I take a serving every hour. I should only need 3 of them if things are going well, but I like to have some extra just in case. Fortunately, I've never had to take the 4th serving, but that's how it's worked for me on the course. It's been spectacular. I felt good every time when I finished up. The one thing I have had to test out has been the electrolytes side of things. I mean, I take the water at every water stop. Like Greg, I'm a triathlete, and I take the UCAN Hydrate when I'm on the bike all the time, but I find on the run it's just too much liquid to be carrying around, and I start sloshing and I'm drinking too much liquid. So I started using a salt mixture. I just carry it in a little tube, and just take that every 15 minutes or so. And the water stops, the UCAN every hour, and it's been working great for me. The last 4 marathons, I feel great before, during, afterwards. I'll have my UCAN with protein for recovery, and I feel good. I'm walking around and going and seeing the sights the next day.
Great stuff, Derek. For Greg and Derek, just one question I wanted to pose to both of you guys before I bring Greg McMillan back on and we wrap this up. So both of you alluded in terms of carrying your UCAN to the fact this is something I wanted to highlight, and Durrett talked about this too. You don't have to necessarily mix up a serving of UCAN with the same amount of water. One of the nice things about UCAN is a serving is more in terms of the amount of the powder you're mixing up versus the volume of fluid. So you could put 2 scoops of the UCAN powder, which could last you about 2 hours, into 4 ounces of water. You could put it into 20 ounces of water. It's really personal preference. For you guys, Greg, I'll start with you. How did you ultimately come up with that determination of how thick do I want it? How thick or thin should I mix it? Any feedback you can say there, just in terms of the consistency of UCAN, having been folks that have, sucked it down as a thick consistency during a race?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of texture. It's a matter of what you become comfortable with. When I first started after we met, I tended to take the shaker bottle, and I needed the half bottle of fluid in there along with the serving. I have gotten to the point where if I've got 5 ounces of water in there, it's just become my comfort with that texture and with the consistency of it being a thicker mixture. I also find that for me, the thicker mixture, together with it being cold, I'm able to take a thicker mixture. That's why I freeze it for when I'm taking that thicker mixture out on the course.
Derek, anything you can add there?
Yeah, I do the same thing. I like 5 ounces for when I'm running. I will at times go a little bit thicker in transitions for triathlon. But I think the key thing, and Greg alluded to it, is he mixes up the day ahead of time and then he freezes it. I don't freeze it, but I do put it in the fridge. I think getting it cold actually does really help that consistency, and you do it the day ahead, and it works really well. The consistency a lot better on the course next day.
Yeah, I'm glad both of you guys said that. You can pre-mix the UCAN. We got a friend joining us. We got the Brady Bunch up here. So, you can mix the UCAN, 3 days in advance, 2 to 3 days in advance. So when you're having it on the course, ice cold makes it a lot more palatable, makes it a lot better. So Greg and Derek, thank you guys both so much. Really appreciate you guys coming on. Thanks for sharing all the feedback as well.
Great to be here.
So Greg, we will now, in wrapping up, turn it back to you. So I wanted to throw a few questions your way, rapid fire, that we had from our folks in the audience. But before I do that, you were just on there listening. Anything that jumped out at you that any of our panelists said?
That's perfect, wasn't it? It really showed that people are finding a good solution for themselves in the marathon, and they have similarities in how they use it, but there's also differences. And we always talk about, that's the cool thing about essentially making your own sports nutrition product. You can mix it how you want. You can carry it how you want. You can use it how you want. And that flexibility is really nice for runners. And I think all those guys really provided wonderful sort of real world examples of how they use it. Again, taking the strategies that we discussed and like, okay, how does it work in the real world? And going and applying it until you really dial it in. And I love the comfort that those guys have. You just know that they are not freaking out at the expo trying to figure out what they're going to use in the race the next day. They're just comfortable. They know what's going to work for them. They just use it as they practice, and bingo, they're having great success. So I love that for sure.
A couple of things I just wanted to add that came out of the whole mixing with water conversation. And then I got two questions from the audience for you, Greg. So people are asking about if you make the consistency of UCAN thicker, do you have to chase it like water, like a gel? So one of the nice things about UCAN is from a digestion standpoint, it doesn't follow the traditional 6 to 8% solution that Greg was talking about. So the way UCAN digests and the properties of this superstarch carbohydrate that's unique to UCAN allows for comfortable digestion with however much fluid you want to mix it with. It's more like Derek and Greg told us about mouthfeel and palatability and taste. So some people do like to chase it simply because it's a little gritty, but scientifically, from a stomach standpoint, not needed. And then, you know, to piggyback off that question, we had somebody asking if you're using UCAN before the race. They've done that a lot, and sometimes they find they have to, you know, for lack of a better term, go to the bathroom because of the fluid. This less water strategy could help out a lot there. So for folks that like the UCAN feeling before a race but struggle with having to utilize the bathroom, simply you could just use less water. Greg, so the two questions I had for you, a little bit out of the realm of what we talked about specifically in terms of marathon fueling, but just the role of caffeine. Anything kind of simple way you could get runners to understand kind of the timing and the role of caffeine as part of this overall fueling strategy?
Yeah, I think Durrett mentioned it. It's really about, can you get the mental system excited? And caffeine has been very successful. Well, I mean, most people have some caffeine to sort of wake themselves up in the morning. And certainly with endurance performance, the research shows, and I think practical evidence is that people, if they take some caffeine during a race, they typically will be a little bit more alert, a little bit more excited. The timing of when they take it, I think, is something they have to work out. Some people will shift it just to the end of the race. That's when they want sort of a big dose. For me, that works a little bit better. Some people are, I want caffeine through the entire event. Caffeine can fatigue the GI system as well. So, you know, if you're going to be out there for a long, long time, ultra runners find this, that they can't just have caffeine all the time. There's sort of a threshold or a fatigue level with ingesting caffeine. So maybe there's some timing issue with that. But I think you can start with the last part of a long run and then the race and see how you feel by taking some caffeine in.
This one was a little UCAN specific, and I wanted to pose this one specifically to you. In terms of UCAN, we've talked a lot about it being all taken at once, a certain dose of it, then spacing out the feedings. But Jeanette says, you know, she's made it thinner and sipped on it through the hour. I know you've utilized that methodology as well yourself. You know, for just from a UCAN standpoint, we recommend the dosing strategy, but we've seen people have success with the sipping strategy. What can you say about that?
Well, that's how I started with it, was sipping every 15 to 20 minutes. And I think part of that was just my brain was still in strategy number one. So it was very difficult to sort of trust I'm going to drink every hour. And so I went with the sipping strategy to begin with. I ultimately found that the once every hour works better for me. But again, I think everybody can just experiment to see. And I think that several of the other presenters mentioned, it's really about just never getting hungry. So finding what strategy will prevent you from ever getting hungry, so you're dosing ahead of time, that's what you should use. For me, it's once every hour, because I get about 90 minutes of energy from every serving. So if I dose every hour, I'm well ahead of when I might start to feel low energy. Everybody has to experiment a little bit. Obviously, if you're going to dose frequently, it's usually less thick. So again, getting to the palatability and what you're comfortable with. I think a lot of us, and I believe Greg mentioned this, is just, I like it more concentrated. I like the fact that I can just get it in. I'm not dumping a ton of fluid into my system that I may have to get rid of later, and that seems to work for me. But ultimately, whatever works for you and whatever gives you power over the last 30 to 60 minutes, that's a great strategy for you in the marathon.
And I think one of the great terms you brought to the table was this idea of feeding, right? We heard Dorette talk about using a serving of UCAN, which got her up to, say, an hour 10 in the marathon. We heard Greg talking about using maybe 2 scoops of UCAN that got him up to the 2-hour mark of the marathon. So however frequently you want to feed with UCAN, you can simply take more or less of it. If you're somebody that says, hey, I want to load up before and not worry about it for 2 hours, great. Take more, mix it however thick or thin you can handle it. And vice versa. If you want to take less and take it every 30 minutes, then you simply don't have to take the full serving. But Greg, with that, I think we covered a lot today. Really appreciate the time. I know this, in terms of this article that you wrote, that was kind of the basis of this webinar on the 3 fueling strategies. I will send that to everyone who joined us today. You can find that on the McMillan Running website. So both this webinar recording and Greg's initial article will both be emailed to you. Will be a really good reference point to review some of the information we've covered today. And Greg, for folks that just want to learn more from you, get more of your tips, what's the best way for them to keep in touch with you and follow you?
I've got my full library of articles and videos and products and services on McMillanRunning.com. So you can go and probably waste a whole day searching around on different running topics. But, my mission is just to help people with their running. And I love this idea of helping people figure out their fueling, because it's going to get really important here in another month or so as people head to their marathons.
And I can say, as someone who has spent a good chunk of my day on McMillan Running, it's not a waste of time. So go check it out. Well, Greg, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone in the audience, for Dorette, Greg, Nicole, and Derek, who all joined us, shared their feedback. We really appreciate it, and really appreciate the great questions and the great participation we got from everyone. So thank you very much, and happy racing.